Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Though now with the new regime, you probably will never hear me saying that because we're going to record a new intro later. But I'll give them room to figure out where to pick up. So our counter-programming month continues by not being directly on the news and instead sort of going deeper, wider, weirder. And recently at the Dispatch, we had this essay that kind of blew up and people were really interested in it and we're talking about it. And I don't blame them because it was really interesting. It was written by Emmett Rensin, who's the author of The Complications, Going Insane in America. And the piece was called The People versus Insanity. And it's kind of a sweeping history of, among other things, the insanity defense, but we can get into all of that. So, Emmett, welcome to the Remnant.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, normally when I have people on like a book tour, I always ask them, the first question is always, what's your book about? Because that's the question I like to get asked when I'm on a book tour. But the book's been out for a little while. It's great. As I was telling you, I started to read it this week. But the essay that you wrote for the Dispatch covers a lot of the same territory, obviously not nearly as in depth as the memoir. So why don't we just sort of start there, and if you can sort of summarize, take a few minutes, take as long as you think you need, sort of summarize, where the insanity defense comes from and why popular conceptions about it are wrong.
Sure. The insanity defense, right now, I talk about this a little bit in the piece. The first sort of formal recognition of it, at least in the West, that we know of, right, is in the legal codes of Justinian, although he's citing earlier Roman law, right? But it's been this concept that's been with us for a very long time. It come up in Roman law, it's come up in church law, it's come up, the thing we recognize as the basis of the insanity defense sort of came up in the earliest English jury trials. But we've always had this intuition, whether it was in a formal sort of legal matter or just in moral philosophy or private moral judgment, that, if somebody's lost their mind in one way or another, they've sort of exited or partially exited the realm of total moral responsibility, right, or total culpability. And in various ways, over the centuries, people have tried to account for that or to dismiss it or to come up with ways to have it bear on sort of social punishment, whether that's, well, they should be punished, but, being a lunatic has already punished them enough, so we don't need to add anything to it, to, older conceptions that are, well, the purpose of sort of criminal justice isn't really to suss out the culpability of some particular person and be fair to them. It's to protect the community. And, this person is dangerous, so we need to, historically chain them to a pillar of a church or lock them in the basement somewhere and forget to feed them, or often just sort of let them wander off and let nature take its course. Up to modernity, where it's well, you are not guilty in the sense that we mean guilt for these reasons, and so we need to, in the sort of current iteration, put you into forcible treatment and then reevaluate the situation sometime in the future. And the piece, right, to my mind, was kind of about three things. The first was just because I find it interesting, and, thank you to you all at the Dispatch for letting me devote thousands of words to Justinian legal codes and what various ecclesiastical councils had to say about this, because I think many places would say, let's get to the 19th century at least to start with. So just, I don't know. I think it's interesting. I
did too. I think it's great. Yeah.
But then more of the meat of it, right, is first the point that, Americans by and large, and both, you can see this both in survey data, but also you can see this by, walking into a bar and striking up a conversation with anybody, have really radical misconceptions about what insanity defenses are, how they work, how you get them, how many people get them, what the rules are, what happens to you. And so I get into that. And I think there is a version of this piece where that would be it, right? We have this very sort of 20th century impulse towards, well, Americans are under a misapprehension, and if we simply corrected that misapprehension and they had all the facts, then they would respond in whatever way the author preferred, that they would all immediately fall in line with some proposed solution. And what I argue there and have argued elsewhere is that that's not really the case, because understanding how the mad defense works in practice doesn't really speak to a deeper issue, which is we don't know and have never known what to do with really serious insanity, especially as it bears on moral life. Whether that's moral life in a criminal justice sense, like, I don't know, to escalate it up to the top, that piece starts with a mass shooter from Colorado who killed, I don't have it in front of me, but quite a lot. I mean, I think near a dozen people, down to, you can go online right now and go to a subreddit or a forum, a support group for, people with like bipolar family members and things like that. And we're not talking about mass murder, but you'll see a lot of, boy, I don't want to blame my husband, my kid, my grandpa, whoever, they're sick, but having to deal with this day in and day out is just driving me nuts. And I can't, and I do still feel, morally injured by their conduct. And we don't have a good solution to that, since almost all of our moral reasoning, take whatever sort of philosophical framework you want, is at least predicated a bit on the idea that people are amenable to reason or to persuasion of some kind. We can expect certain things from other people. There are very few moral philosophies that say, and this also applies to dogs, for obvious reasons. We don't expect much of animals. And serious madness and, sort of things that are not culturally bound or relatively modern invention, right? We know that something like what we would call schizophrenia or manic depression has existed probably forever and in all places. We have ancient Greek accounts of patients who sound like they're having manic episodes. We don't know what to do that at that point, right? You've left the realm of culpability to some extent, and we don't know what to do. And maybe unsatisfyingly, I guess my piece gets to the point of, and by the way, I also don't know what we should do with this.
Right. Yeah. So, I kind of want to save your personal stuff for later, but just sort of for table setting for listeners, I'm not revealing anything that you didn't write about in the piece, that you didn't write a memoir about. You've struggled with bipolar disorder and or at least diagnoses, and the only reason I'm bringing it up now is you are refreshingly neglectful of a lot of the euphemistic language and all of this, which is something that I sometimes struggle with in some of these, in all sorts of areas. It's like the language policing. I'll give you one example. I was on NPR once a couple of years ago and said something about, I don't know, that this was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs or crazier than a moon batter or something, some sort of idiom like that. And I got a call later from a producer saying, you just understand that phrases like that are offensive to the neurodivergent. And my problem with those kinds of phrases, sort of like body positive, right? You can come up with new labels for things, but very quickly people are going to understand what they're describing, and they're going to take on the connotations that the previous terms did. And I'm sort of wondering how you think about the issue of language, and like what kind of pushback have you gotten from people about it?
I don't think I've gotten that much pushback on that kind of language. I think because, right, from my book, or I write things that aren't personal, but anytime that stuff comes up in my writing, right, I have to say at some point, the DSM axis diagnosis is schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, and we could do 20 minutes on whether or not that term will even exist in the next edition of the DSM, but. Yeah. For shorthand, it's symptoms of psychosis akin to schizophrenia plus mood disturbances akin to manic depression. Although the psychosis isn't quite as totalizing as in sort of pure schizophrenia, which is probably why I'm on this podcast and not, on a street somewhere. But with that kind of stuff, no, I think because I am of that population. I have sort of carte blanche to say whatever I want to call myself a lunatic, that's my business. When I get pushback, and this comes up in my book, and it's like 10 pages of the book, though in some readers' minds, it's like 100 pages of the book, I'll refer to like ADHD havers or anxiety and depression havers. And I think this is sort of taken to be derisive. And I guess I can be coy and say I'm not being derisive. I am being a little bit derisive. Although I say in the book, and I would say now, and I'd say anywhere, it's terrible to have crippling anxiety. I'm never doubting the sort of qualia of suffering in those cases, just that it has some sort of downstream political consequences that I'm a little skeptical of. Yeah, I'm not, I could pretend, and maybe it's true a little bit, that my preference for terms like lunatic or crazy, or frankly, I prefer manic depressive to bipolar, is political, and it is a little bit. I do think, like any sort of Byzantine language game, it can get a little bit silly. I actually do understand the spirit of something like person with schizophrenia. I understand the idea of they're a human being first, and it's easy to roll your eyes at that, and I have rolled my eyes at it. That said, you will roll your eyes a lot less if I would just invite anybody who really finds that a useless concept to spend 72 hours in a public hospital's involuntary hold being treated as a schizophrenic and not a person. It gives you a certain amount of sympathy for that impulse, at least, if not the sort of fanatical enforcement of language norms in contexts in which they don't matter very much. My real preference is that obviously 18th and 19th century people were a lot better at language epithets than we are. I mean, manic depressive sounds great. Bipolar, fine. And actually, to your point, right, bipolar was introduced in the DSM-3 because manic depressive was stigmatized. And now, of course, bipolar is something you call an ex you don't like, or a friend who's giving you trouble. It has just taken on all of those negative connotations. I think we're a person with bipolar disorder now, a person struggling with, I don't know. I mean, they used to have even better old ones. I mean, schizophrenia used to be dementia praecox, which is fun, but I would never use because nobody knows what that is. Schizophrenia is really just a famous misnomer because it means split mind, and that's not what's being described.
I've been trying to explain this to glandular young right-wingers forever, and I've completely lost this fight, that it's fine to fight political correctness, but just because being a dick is politically incorrect is not a defense of being rude.
Sure.
And similarly, we can argue about whether, political correctness, or whatever term we're supposed to use today for it, wokeness or whatever, we can argue about how much of it is bad, but there is some statistically important amount of it that is good, in the sense that it's just an attempt to use for good manners, of like showing respect to people and how you talk to them. And, the example I always use is, it used to be perfectly socially acceptable to use the word Negro. Sure. And then it stopped being, and black people wanted to be called black or African American. And it's just a sign of simple, basic civic decency to call people what they want to be called. And so now the use of the word Negro is either ironic or offensive. And you can call that political correctness to stop using Negro, or you can just say it's good manners because language evolves or whatever. And I think that's true of a lot of these things, like the desire these days is for no longer saying he committed suicide, but died by suicide. And I get where people are coming from. I'm not sure I'm completely persuaded about it yet, but you talk to people who have family members who had severe depression, who committed suicide, or died by suicide. There I go. And I had a brother who basically died from his addictions. There's room for allowing some people to have the language that makes them feel comfortable. My problem with it is that when it becomes like a political project to delegitimize policy options or that kind of thing, where it stops being good manners and starts having a more robust ideological agenda to it.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, right, on to what extent do you believe that words have magical powers? Mm-hmm. If somebody comes up to me and calls me a schizo, it's not that that's intrinsically offensive. It's that I assume that somebody who says that to me is about to be horrible to me in other ways. It's just a warning sign. But sure, there is a class of people who would probably refer to themselves as neurodivergent, but who knows? I'm sure it varies. For whom the primary stakes of, in some cases, what I think of as fairly trivial and perhaps even fictional mental difficulties, and in some cases legitimate and serious mental issues, they've reached a point, a fortunate point, if they have those more serious issues, where the sort of language games are the primary stakes. And I didn't write about this in my piece for you all, but I've written about it elsewhere, that, there's a point where you end up engaging in what are effectively respectability and language politics, because those are the only politics left to you. Mm-hmm. I don't think that there are. Well, here's what I'll say. I'll say it just personally. At my worst, it wouldn't have occurred to me to be bothered by language. It's only at the point in which, I have some distance and things are going fairly well that, I can start to say, well, yeah, I guess, a person with schizophrenia is a little bit, sort of emphasizes something. But I don't think, right, because I am, I guess, unlike you, like a left-wing and a dedicated materialist. And so, in the sector of the left that has been very suspicious of identitarian movements. And part of the reason is, right, I just tend to think that culture is downstream of the conditions of society and not the other way around. I don't know that we can tell people to say persons struggling with mental illness so aggressively that suddenly we fund community healthcare for the mentally ill. Yeah, I suspect that if we funded community healthcare for the mentally ill, what we were calling them would really actually become sort of trivial and not matter very much anymore. But you can win that fight. You can yell at someone to stop calling you a name in a way that you can't yell at somebody to stop having, disproportionate amounts of the homeless population and killed by police officers population and incarcerated populations being people with untreated mental illness. You can't Twitter somebody into not doing that anymore.
That's a good, and just for the record, like, if I have to pick a team on the left to root for, it's definitely the ones who are, like, I can argue with a irreducible materialist about things in a way that you cannot. That's my problem with the identity politics stuff. Is a lot of it is a game of I have unique status that is not bridgeable through argument and reason. Right? It is like, how dare you argue with me, a person of this skin color, this sexual orientation, blah blah blah, as if the math is different for you than it is for everybody else. That's the kind of argumentation I cannot stand. I thought some of those, what was it, the wobbly guys, the IWW guys who did the critiques of the 1619 Project, that was some of the best stuff that was done, and that was done in service to, sort of kind of Marxist tradition kind of thing. But it was still good. It was real arguments based in facts and history and all that kind of stuff. And I love that kind of thing.
Sure. I mean, I'm a little bit, the notion that there are certain ways of being in the world that are sort of incommensurable and incommunicable and privileged special forms of knowledge. I actually believe that. I simply believe that it's true of everyone because I am, beyond sort of my political commitments, a dedicated Freudian. And I think we haven't gone far enough. It's not simply that if you are, I don't know, mentally ill or an ethnic minority or whatever, you have epistemological access to experiences that are incomprehensible. In fact, everybody has access to experiences that are incomprehensible. We can't know each other. All interpersonal relations are based on transference delusions. And if you actually looked into the Lacanian real, it would be like looking at the face of an angel and you'd die. So I think we should actually encourage that way of thinking. It should just be much, much more general.
I mean, this is not the argument. No, this is not the discussion I planned on having. But I am not a committed Freudian. But I tend to agree with you in this sense, which is that in the sort of classical liberal tradition, this idea that every individual human being has dignity and that you should judge them based on their own actions rather than their membership in an abstract category is sort of my view, but it is the response to this idea that the identity politics idea, identity almost always ends up being about loyalty to an abstract category rather than about individuality. And so I'm with you insofar as I'm not sure about seeing the face of an angel stuff, but I am with you on the idea that everybody's hard to know. Everybody lives in their own sort of microverse, and that the pursuit of happiness is an individual right, not a collective right. And and some people are going to do it in different ways, and that's fine by me.
I'm personally surprised that you are not taking my absolutely sincere belief that to know anything about any other person would instantly kill you as a very persuasive position. No, it's good. Look, we're all into identity, Paul, right? The young right wingers you described earlier, who just want to call people retards to be edgy, right? This is an identity politics. They're just very committed to, I don't know, the Volk, the very sort of weak Volk that you wouldn't want populating an actual German army division, but they can.
Yeah, no, the right today, the contemporary right, certainly the MAGA right, is shot through with identity politics. I mean, Christian nationalism, all these kinds of things. I'm not disputing that. I just don't like it. If I don't like it on the left, I shouldn't love it on the right, and I don't like it I just don't like it. I don't like it, the logic of it. I don't like the metaphysics of it. And I agree with you. Yeah, there's always going to be some sort of, like, I always try to make this point. There's a difference between ethnic politics and identity politics. Ethnic politics is like, if you're campaigning in a Hispanic neighborhood, you speak Spanish to people. Sure. That's like I'm sure the founding fathers generation, when they went to Western Pennsylvania, if you told them, "Oh, you can't speak German to Germans," they would say, "What are you talking about?" Right? I mean, that's just sort of the urban politics has always been about ethnic politics and all kind of reaching out to communities where they are. The identity politics thing is a much more robust metaphysical claim about the power of whiteness or being of color or whatever it is, being immune to persuasion, reason, immune to this idea that the old Leonard Jeffries stuff about thinking it, which was very much like the Nazi stuff, which was like, there are black ways of thinking and there are white ways of thinking, there are Aryan ways of thinking. I just reject all that stuff. The polylogism stuff I just think is garbage. And even if there's some marginal truth that we could scrounge for, with truffle pigs, it is no way to organize a society. And so it's really just not worth pursuing too much. But I mean, you can respond to that, or we can get back to the other stuff.
Oh no, I was just going to say my only experience of this is that I with ethnic politics is that I live in a neighborhood where elderly Greek men yell at me that I'm a hipster all of the time, because all non-Greek men under the age of 60 here are hipsters, which now includes like 35-year-old married Catholics.
Yeah. So, but you were talking about before about in your dialectical materialism, about what we would call people if we were fully funded community healthcare. That's a good place to sort of swing back to, which is like when I was growing up, I grew up in New York City in the 1970s and 80s, and you write about it in your piece, about deinstitutionalization. I watch it every spring, right? Every late spring, the Bellevue patients would be released because they could sleep on the streets again safely, quote unquote, safely. They wouldn't freeze to death. And they terrify. I mean, I'm a little kid, and like my brother once, a homeless woman, crazy person, sorry, was talking to herself, and my brother passed by her, and she reached out with, kind of gross homeless person fingernails and scratched his face, and badly, and like it got infected. I mean, it was I don't want to be too broad, but like there were times where it felt kind of demonic, right? Where like because the criminals, you know how to anticipate behavior, but some of the people that were let out every spring, it's the unpredictability that I think made people so at ease. And anyway, I bring this up is I think this is, I've cited this, actually mentioned this last week on a podcast before I knew I was going to be talking about this. The single greatest, among the greatest examples of how bipartisanship can get public policy wrong. Everyone was, we need more bipartisanship. And I agree there'd be good things to be more bipartisan about, was the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, where the Republicans basically did it to save money. The Libertarians did it because they were enthralled to Thomas Zaz, and the Democrats did it because they were convinced that it was all cruel gulag and that we're torturing people. There was some truth to that part, but we've kind of just washed our hands of our obligations to some of these people. How I know you say you don't have an answer to it. Do you have some partial answers? Like, how would you What would you want to see done that's doable?
Yeah, well, that's doable is always an interesting question. Yeah, no, it is certainly true that deinstitutionalization through now, I mean, there are obviously many groups who at least are convinced that everybody is out to get them. I suspect the seriously mentally ill, and I guess this is probably the place for the caveats that, of course, most people, even with serious mental illness, are not, scratching anyone's face. But that's who we're talking about, right? If someone is quietly suffering at home, this is,
Right.
while sad, not typically a public policy concern.
I'm thinking like, remember Larry Hogue? I mean, you're much younger than I am, but Larry Hogue they did a 60 Minutes piece about this guy. He was the madman of 96th Street. And he was a guy who would go off his meds and onto crack, which is not a great move. And he was famous for pushing old ladies and little kids into traffic on 96th Street. And he kept getting released because he would go to prison, go to jail. They would give him his meds. He would get better. He would then pass some sort of test and he'd be re-released. And it was like one of like the fundamental law and order culture war up there with like Bernie Getz kind of issues where like that drove a lot of the conversation about crime and stuff in New York City in the late 80s and early 90s. And those cases are real. And I agree with you. Probably for every one Larry Hogue, there were probably 100 people who aren't doing anything terrible to people, but the Larry Hogues were a real problem.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, like I was saying, I do think that deinstitutionalization through now, the seriously mentally ill are maybe one of two groups, that there is a legitimate ongoing American bipartisan campaign to destroy in various ways. But I don't know that they're right. Like, frustratingly, in my book and everything I write, it isn't clear what the correct public answer would be, because it is actually true that old mental asylums were vampires' castles. They were torture facilities. The shame of the states is sort of the classic work on this. But, men who had been soldiers who liberated concentration camps then went to American mental institutions and said that was really the only point of comparison that they could think of. And we had, it seems silly now, but the incredibly barbaric treatments for mental illness into the 20th century. They used to remove all of your teeth. There was the superintendent of, I think, the New Jersey public hospital system decided, well, you get gum infections, and a lot of his patients had them because they had poor hygiene because they were extremely ill, and your gums are kind of near your brain, so maybe the disease or the inflammation is causing the mental symptoms, so they would yank all of your teeth out. And like the lobotomy, it did have the effect of making the patients shut up, which was probably really the point. So that was true. It is also true that, right, the primary group that suffers from releasing a bunch of people with no support plan and no treatment onto the streets is not even the people who are occasionally struck by them. It's that population, it's people who are a lot of, and especially, look, a lot of the behavior we associate with serious untreated mental illness is probably a result of serious untreated mental illness plus debilitating poverty and homelessness, right? Mm-hmm. If you spend any time homeless, I think one of the first things you figure out is that you never sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. Even if you get 6 hours of sleep in a night, it's an hour and a half on this bench, then 45 minutes under this tree. And, anyone who's ever had a young child or for any reason had to get up constantly knows you do that long enough, even if you weren't crazy, you will become crazy. What can we do with that? Well, right, this is what happened after deinstitutionalization. It turned out the part of the alliance, the libertarian and the Reaganite part that, didn't want to pay for mental institutions also didn't want to pay for community health care. So, and I wrote about this last year for the Times in the aftermath of the Daniel Penny trial, that we're in an odd place where, broadly speaking, the liberal perspective is that we can't really force anybody into treatment, and if anything bad happens because of that, you're a bigot. And the broad right-wing position is we need to force all of these people into treatment, but it can't cost a single dollar to do that. Yeah. And I just did some sort of, back of the envelope calculations on the lower end of the average per day price to hold someone in a psych ward, then just sort of stipulate, let's say 2% of all schizophrenics had to be institutionalized at any given time, which isn't a lot. Mm-hmm. And the amount that this would cost, it exceeds the the budget of the Department of the Interior. Right? Which would be an incredibly expensive process. And that's if you are comfortable with locking people up. And if you're comfortable, well, for how long, right? 72 hours, that's probably too short.
Yeah.
forever. That's obviously a suspension of their civil liberties. If we don't lock them up until they push somebody into a subway train, well, you're not solving the problem of people getting pushed into subway trains. People stabilize on their meds all the time, leave and stop taking their meds. Now, you could reduce some of that. I mean, again, I'm although not really political anymore, still a socialist in my heart. Of course, like, however, by whatever scheme you want to achieve it, universal healthcare would obviously bridge some of that gap, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are people who they don't take their meds because they went to the pharmacy after being released from the hospital and they don't have anywhere to live. And sorry, we don't have the generic lamotrigine. You have to buy brand name Lamictal, and that's $100 for your 30-day supply. And well, I don't have $100, so I'm not taking my mood stabilizer. So that's the end of that.
Mm-hmm.
But some people also don't like to take their meds. I've taken, I was, aside from some teenage stuff that never really lasted, was put on serious medication about 11 years ago. And probably the last 5 or 6 years, I've basically taken it every day. But even though I don't suffer, right, from like anagnosia, which is the thing about 50% of people with any neurological disorder, whether it's schizophrenia or Alzheimer's, will have, where you just can't accept that you have the problem. I don't have that issue. I know that I have the problem. I still would stop taking my meds. I mean, when I was first medicated, I was put on this enormous dose of lithium, and lithium really does work, which is remarkable because it's not the invention of a pharmaceutical company. It's a rock salt. It's like a magic rock out of a medieval chronicle. And I'd gotten this job. I just started. I worked, at Vox.com for a while. And I moved to DC, and it's a new life, new people. It's exciting. I get to walk by the Capitol every day, to back when digital media news startups had big offices with Keurig machines and things. And, I was an editor, and I was doing my editing, and they wanted me to write, and I was trying to write something. And every night I would go back to my crappy, overpriced, linoleum-filled apartment and just feel so disgusted and tired, and was gaining weight and had like an uncontrollable appetite, and would wake up tired and go to sleep tired. And I couldn't do the piece. And I was like, I'm just going to stop taking these pills. And the thing is, people say, why do people go off their meds? Well, it works. I stopped taking the pills, and 2 months later, I'd produced several pieces, one of which is probably still the most read thing in the history of that website. And it took another few months for, to start getting the calls that are like, you need to stop tweeting. You're now suspended from your job. You need to go to a hospital. You're having a manic episode. There's a really beautiful window where you can become sort of floridly liberated from the deadening effects of this medication before it gets bad. So of course people go off it. Now there are ways to deal with it. Of course, robust community care would encourage some people, although there are problems, right? Some people don't want to take their medication, and some people the medication doesn't help that much. And really, like, the meds I'm on now work pretty well, but they aren't the first meds I was put on. Every few months when I see a psychiatrist, if something's going on, they'll say, well, let's bring this up 10 milligrams. Let's bring that down 50 milligrams. Like any form of medicine, right? If you have, a heart attack or a heart problem, and you see your cardiologist once, they'll give you emergency treatment and a diet, but you're going to do a lot better if you have the means and the wherewithal to keep going back, keep checking, do some more tests every few years. And that's just hard to come by, and doesn't work for everyone. And the medication sucks. Being on it sucks. And it's not clear what to do. I mean, my book, you haven't finished it. The very last thing in the book is this woman, I think her name was Paulette Wilkie, although I wrote the book 4 years ago. I might be wrong about that, who was mentally ill. I don't remember, schizophrenia, some serious form of mental illness. And she sort of famously lived behind an alley behind a deli, I think in Pittsburgh. It might have been Philadelphia, it was somewhere in Pennsylvania. They tried interventions. She hadn't been able to keep a job, and she'd lived with her dad, but her dad said, look, you have to take your meds or I'm kicking you out. And she wouldn't take her meds. And he was afraid of her because she got kind of violent. And so that's the point. Like, it's her father. Should he have to take care of her? Well, maybe. But on the other hand, was afraid of her. And there's a version of the story where he doesn't kick her out and then she's in jail for murdering him, right? That could happen. So, okay, fine. She's out. She goes to a group home because she also has drug problems. But at the group home, she's causing problems. She gets into fights with people. Now, the group home, which is community care, this is who they should have to deal with. But on the other hand, she's making the experience worse for everyone else. She's interfering with other people's care. And eventually they're going to say, look, 19 people getting good treatment is more important than you getting some treatment and everyone else getting bad treatment. So she's out. And anyway, eventually she's living on the street, and it's a very cold night. And, they have the vans that go around that say, hey, it's going to be minus 20 Fahrenheit tonight. Why don't you get in here? We'll give you a thermal blanket, or we'll take you to a shelter. And she refused. And she's an adult. Mm-hmm. Now, we could drag her kicking and screaming, I guess, into a van every time it gets cold out. But it's beyond that being impractical. It's, it doesn't look good. And I don't think it's treating people well. So she freezes to death. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where surely it can't be that she did that. I mean, in some sense, she did do it to herself. On the other hand, same thing with the mad defense. We all have this intuition that once you're crazy to a certain point, you did it to yourself, sort of, not in the way that if you and I just said, you know what, let's just, shoot some heroin right now, we'd be doing it to ourselves in full possession of our faculties. On the other hand, it's very hard to locate the point in which the system that failed her, whether that's familial, whether it's city resources, sort of running the full gamut from private to public points of intervention. Yeah, they all failed her, but they all had kind of good reasons to fail her. Mm-hmm. So some of these problems just become unsolvable. And we tend to think, and definitely people in the 60s and 70s during deinstitutionalization thought this, that the reason you can go back to Plato and find him fretting over what to do with people with these conditions, and you can find it in the Justinian legal code, and you can find British juries, is that these people in the past were just stupid, right? They didn't try very hard. They weren't as sensible as we are. And we think this about all sorts of problems. And what I think you discover, and this is perhaps my most conservative impulse, is the more you learn, the more you realize that people in the past, right, were frequently, even if they didn't have all the information we had, were often just as committed as we were to thinking through things and trying their best. And if a problem has vexed us for 2,000 years, it's probably not because everybody didn't listen to your one tweet solution to how to solve it right now. It's that it's very hard.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, so that's, I mean, I'm there's a grand tradition in sort of British politics of muddling through, right? And this is one of those things where, I mean, I hate to use a cliche, but it really is kind of an all of the above thing. Some people need to be involuntarily committed. A lot more don't. But you need, I think a lot of people who are nostalgic about the 18th and 19th centuries, and there's a riot of this kind of crappy thinking on the right these days. They don't appreciate how many like crazy Uncle Bobs were basically locked in a shed in the backyard or in the attic. There was a lot of that kind of thing. Lots of religious institutions that probably did not treat people great. And we know the mental institutions in the 20th century did not treat people great. It's worth remembering also, though, that while the excesses were terrible, like those mental institutions were not, the goal wasn't, hey, let's torture a bunch of people. It was, crap, this is the best we can come up with. And then the desensitizing and dehumanization of bureaucracies kicks in, and you get One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and all that kind of stuff. But I agree with you. I wish there was a silver bullet answer to these things. I've been following this issue to one extent or another for a really long time, partly because of growing up around it, but also like Madness in the Streets, this book that came out in the late 80s, had a big impact on me. And I've just never seen anything that approaches like, here's this one neat trick. At the same time, there are some obvious things that are worth doing. Like, I agree with you, funding community mental health stuff. You have to stipulate with all these things. I would like to see it done well, sure. On which, you have to sort of stipulate. But, all right. So can I ask this is just a basic human question. So when you've had your episodes earlier in your life, and you heard voices.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. The psychosis for me was more delusional thinking. But I have heard voices, but what I haven't had is the thing that I think totally destroys your life, which is a bunch of voices yell at you unrelentingly for days or weeks on end. Like, I've spared that.
But so the voices that you hear, is it a figurative hearing it, or is it like literally you feel like you're hearing it through your ears? Is it voices inside your head or voices outside your head?
It's I think somewhere in my book I have this joke, is like, if somebody says, what is it like if the voices tell you to do something? Well, what is it like when your mom tells you to do something? Like, it's actually very trivial. It's an interesting question, right? Because I know intellectually, but an example in my book, and this is one of the thankfully rare occasions where I really received what get called command hallucinations, which was, I thought God was telling me to crash my car. What I remember it as is, yes, a voice, an external voice, which I understood to be the voice of God, as sort of materially embodied as your voice coming over, my laptop speakers, saying it. Now, I know intellectually, I guess, and maybe there's a slim chance God really was trying to communicate directly with me in that moment, but stipulating that it was a symptom of mental illness, there was no sound wave, right? Nothing impacted my eardrums, causing some section of my brain to decode it as noise. So surely there was no material thing that I actually heard, but I experienced it that way, and I remember it that way. I mean, there's a book, before, in sort of, at least it's been stipulated, whenever people start talking about Neolithic practices, I sort of wonder how we know this, because they didn't write anything down, but allegedly, right, it was the early human condition to assume that all of your thoughts were the intrusions of divine and of gods or fairies or whatever they were calling their sort of supernatural entities. And it's just sort of part of the evolution of human cognition that we hear an internal monologue as an internal thing. But I think if you thought it was external, you might start to convince yourself you were hearing it. I don't know. I know that the experience is, mundanely as if someone is talking to you.
Yeah.
From nowhere, but
I mean, it's literally like, the word genius goes back to, it's basically, we used to think we were visited by muses, and inspirational pixies and whatnot that gave us these, flights of genius, and the root for a lot of that stuff goes to things like genie or djinn and that kind of thing.
What's Socrates talking about when he says that a daemon is constantly harassing him to talk to people, even though, I mean, maybe it's a metaphor, but he's describing a voice with an agenda different from his that will tell him to do things he doesn't want to do. Like, hey, go, that guy thinks he knows what virtue is. Go ask him what virtue is. No, that's not a good answer. Ask him again. I mean, I don't want to come on here and posit like, the true history of Socrates is the history of the world's highest functioning unmedicated schizophrenic. But clearly this has always been part of human cognition to some extent, right? Everyone has occasional hallucinatory experience, occasional delusional thinking, depending on who you ask. People are having extensive delusional thinking all of the time. Your capacity to sort of delineate it from reality, or the extent to which it kind of dominates your thought process or is sufficiently abnormal to cause antisocial behavior. I mean, this is to your muddling through point, right? Imagine if the hardest thing about mental illness is that the target of the disease is human subjectivity, right? It doesn't change your liver, it changes you. I mean, imagine if a symptom of being diabetic was that 5% of diabetic people became erratic and scary in public. Well, we do have a treatment for, we have insulin injections and we have antipsychotics, and diabetes is sort of, some people are willing to treat theirs and some people aren't, and some people know they have it and some people don't, and some people can afford the treatment and some people can't. And if it were a public safety issue, the only solution to which was we have to just eradicate type 2 diabetes, it would become a lot clearer, I think, to a lot of people, that there isn't a sort of a magical solution to that problem. It's a huge set of logistical concerns that, have not been successfully solved yet. Now, maybe tomorrow they'll invent fourth generation antipsychotics and they will treat everybody incredibly efficacious. It'll have a 99% cure rate, and then this won't be a problem anymore. But we don't have the technology.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, cures are really desirable for lots of things. So so this is another sort of offbeat question, but a friend of the podcast, he's been on here a bunch of times, Paul Bloom, used to be the head of the psychology department at Yale. Now he's somewhere up in Canada planning the invasion. And he's a big booster of AI as for therapeutic purposes, and if it works, right? I mean, he says
Sure.
got to kick the tires on it, but like particularly for old people, there's just a terrible epidemic of loneliness, and you're going to have a lot of people who are kind of shut in. And if it gives them someone that gives them the illusion of having somebody to talk to, then what's the harm, right? I have not made up my mind about all of that, but he makes a kind of good case. The question I have is the technology, the way the AI technology is going for people who are already inclined to hear voices and imagine conspiracies and stuff out there. Is this going to, if you had to bet or guess, is it going to be a net positive for people in this community, or is it going to exacerbate some pre-existing problems,
I'm of sort of two minds here. One,
so to speak?
yeah, one. We don't have to speculate that it'll be bad. We know it'll be bad because we've already had people who ChatGPT convinced to go off their meds.
Yeah.
Did we seem to have people who don't have pre-existing mental illness who ChatGPT induces psychosis in somehow? I mean, right? Psychosis is a lot of ways to become psychotic. You can smoke too much weed or talk to ChatGPT for too long. You don't have to be schizophrenic.
Yeah.
And of course, right, part of this is just that, it is part of the design of mainstream AIs to just flatter you endlessly. So if you start telling it, look, I don't think I am crazy. I think I know that I am actually Jesus Christ. Eventually the ChatGPT is going to be like, you're very brave for knowing that and to standing up to people who don't believe it.
Yeah.
So there's that problem. Just in terms of loneliness, I don't know. I guess it strikes me in a very unkind way of vaguely pathetic if your only friend is a chatbot.
That's how it feels to me aesthetically.
Right. On the other hand, there's even seen that in therapy. There's nothing wrong with talking to the computer if you want to talk to the computer. I mean, who cares? If ChatGPT can do therapy, that says more bad things about therapy as a discipline than about the AI. But sure, almost all therapeutic, non-psychiatric, so non-medical, but talk therapy practice now is just following instructions from a manual. No offense to any therapist who I'm sure you're much more sensitive in your modalities, but you can just go buy the cognitive behavioral therapy manual and do the manual. And I'm sure we can feed the AI the manual. And I'm sure it can give those outputs. And maybe an AI would actually be a perfect Freudian analyst because it cannot get bored or engage in any non-transference relationship while it lets you free associate for an hour and then just makes private notes about you. On the other hand, every technology is taken to induce insanity, and regressing one era is taken to relax it. So it was thought at one time, right, that like kind of mad people were literally animals. The historic thing is 90% are animals and 10% are sages. So if you're really lucky, you got to be a saint or a mystic. But if you were the other 90%, you were basically an animal. And then as, enclosure happened and the majority of populations moved into cities, right, it was taken to be the fact that the city itself was making people crazy, that the number of people, that the noise, that this was inducing madness. And the way to treat that was to go to the country. And the moral treatment movement that started in France and came here was largely predicated on that. And I think there's some insight there that if you're going to be unwell, being in a really pretty relaxing environment probably helps abate your symptoms some. And that was fine until we invented television and the internet, at which point, right, well, that's what's it's being a shut-in and just watching TV, having things beamed into you, and people's delusions start to take on those forms. Well, I'm getting messages through the TV, I'm getting messages through the internet. Then, 10 years ago, I think I say this in my book, just close the laptop and like go for a walk through Manhattan became the new go out to the country. Just take one step back. Yeah. And I imagine at some point we'll say AI is making people crazy. And what you need to do is stop talking to AI and just boot up Netflix and watch a show that doesn't talk back to you or interact with some real people's tweets.
Play Candy Crush.
We'll invent something worse and then just talk to ChatGPT will be the way to abate your symptoms.
No, it's funny. So when my first job in Washington, I was a research assistant for a syndicated columnist. And this is back when you still got lots of snail mail. And he would get mail from people insisting that they were getting, it's not just a cliche or a boogiemeiser or whatever. It's he would get from different people insisting that they were getting messages through their fillings. That was a big thing, right? And in part, it was because there were my understanding of this is that there were very isolated incidents where people were picking up radio waves, and that idea incepted itself in a lot of people's heads, and people ran away with it. And so like you can see the same sort of impulse. Jared Loughner, the guy who shot Gabby Giffords in Arizona, he was getting messages through his TV about grammar or whatnot. The question I have, though, is you mentioned this in, I can't remember if it's in the piece or in the book, but when you were having an episode, you had grandiose conspiracy theories, and it does seem like conspiracy theorizing is kind of a universal problem with people with these various conditions. Do you have a theory about why conspiracy theories are so seductive for this population?
Yeah, I actually just wrote a piece maybe 3 weeks ago for Compact about conspiracy theories. So people are welcome to breach the paywall and read that. But my response based on that is that actually, what is a conspiracy theory? Because nobody can define that coherently and in a way that everybody else would agree to. Delusions, I think, and I'm not a clinician, right? I'm just a patient, but my understanding is that they tend to come in two varieties. One is grandiose and the other is persecutory. Mm-hmm. So either I'm God or God's trying to kill me. Mm-hmm. I'm James Bond or the CIA is trying to kill me. Mm-hmm. What they share in common, right, is what gets called a delusion of reference, right? And this is sort of the maddening thing in any psychosis, is over-activating the sense that you need to pay attention to seemingly trivial things because they're actually happening in reference to you and you need to react in some way, right? I think it's seductive, right? Because they like a conspiracy theory broadly defined, even though you, again, can't find two people to tell you what a conspiracy theory is in the same way. They involve the seeming access to knowledge predicated on alleged connections between things that are not widely accepted as true. Mm-hmm. Now, I say in that piece, I'll say now, a psychotic and a conspiracy theorist are different in some really fundamental ways. One, a psychotic believes everything happens in reference to them. A psychotic also believes that they have access to secret knowledge. Mm-hmm. And if you tell a psychotic that they're wrong, they say the CIA is following me, and you say, no, the CIA is not following you. They just get angry. They don't argue with you. They just decide you're in on it at a certain point. A conspiracy theorist is actually a much more humble person. All they believe is that actually they don't have access to secret knowledge, that people are doing things all the time that they're not being upfront about, right? That when the president comes on TV and says, I'm authorized our troops to, land in Baghdad, that there are maybe reasons he did that aren't, because we love freedom here. Mm-hmm. They're very humble. They will argue with you. They think the next piece of evidence will definitely convince you that, the trilateralists are actually behind everything. The extent to which I think conspiracy theorists get thought of as mentally ill comes from the idea that the psychological study of conspiracy theories, which has been a very attractive subject for psychological research, is actually the study of conspiracy thinking. Mm-hmm. And the one conspiracy theory I'll tell you I believe is it's remarkable that we've developed an entire academic discipline that's basic conclusion is that if you are radically skeptical of, for example, the claims of your government, you're a mentally ill loser. Right? Because what they'll say is, well, people who are conspiracy theorists, they tend to be poor. They tend to have bad social connections. They tend to be more likely than the average person to carry a gun around in public. They tend to have poor attachment styles. I mean, it seems like a big advertisement for do you really want to believe that the CIA experimented with LSD, or are you're too handsome for that? You're way too well adjusted to believe things like that. Please don't look at any of the findings of the church committee. So I don't know. I mean, I don't believe in, again, when people say I believe or I don't believe in conspiracy theories, they almost certainly believe in some things that other people would call conspiracy theories. They won't. I think another thing is that conspiracy theorists or conspiracy thinking tends to be highly organized in some ways. They do have answers. Psychosis, one of the biggest sort of, and this is a language, it's not language policing, but it's from that same sort of line of thought as hating romanticizing mental illness. And I tend to agree, because one of the biggest things we do is go, oh, well, yeah, he's crazy, but it makes you into a sort of creative genius. Mm-hmm. And we imagine that psychotic delusions are really interesting. Mm-hmm. And they're really not, right? They mm-hmm. are almost always you got a bunch of inputs from culture and you put them in kind of a blender and they get sort of vomited. That's why it's always, if the CIA is in the news, it's the CIA. If aliens are in the news, it's UFOs.
Yeah.
I talk about this in the book too, that Joker movie, the first one, not the musical, the 2019 one that people hated. If you just cut out the 20 minutes about Batman that aren't very good, it's a really interesting movie about deinstitutionalization, and it's sort of apex is him going on, Joaquin Phoenix goes on a talk show and just says a bunch of things about how people are out to get him and he's going to show them. And part of what I think it does really effectively is nothing he's saying is profound, interesting, original, or true. It's just a lot of miasma he's picked up. And that's what's like go to a psych ward. It bothers me whenever people go, well, Kanye West said this anti-Semitic thing, and being mentally ill doesn't make you say anti-Semitic things. Like, I really invite you to go to any psych ward. You were going to hear, you know why? Because you cannot live in culture without absorbing at some point the allegation that Jews control the world. So when you're making your smoothie of persecutory delusions, it's going to be in the mix.
Yeah. So we don't have time to get deep in the weeds on it. I'm not sure I agree with you entirely about all the conspiracy stuff, but there's this guy, Joseph Uzinski, from University of Miami, I want to say. He's been on here a couple times. He's I can't remember what it is, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on it, but he's got he writes about conspiracy theories, and he's got a definition that I find really plausible, but I will concede your point that lots of people it's very difficult to get consensus about what a conspiracy theory is. Jesse Walker's book, United States of Paranoia, he's a libertarian guy. It's a great book, and don't agree with all of that either. But one of the points I think he makes that I think is that you would probably agree with is, so I have big problems with Richard Hofstadter's paranoid style in American politics. Yeah. Because it's one of these things that is sort of warmed over warmed over Adorno, that basically defines being right wing as being crazy and anti-intellectual, but there's nothing crazy or anti-intellectual on the fringe left. It's always on the fringe right. And part of Walker's point is that even if you take a more generous view of Hofstadter and say, well, paranoia and conspiracy theories are just fringe things, it leaves out the fact that the establishment, the center, has conspiracy theories too. They just go by names like moral panics.
Sure. Right? Yes. Look, there's something I pointed out in this piece. If you go online, you can read lots and lots of pieces about how a cause of conspiracy theories or of misinformation is that bad actors, and the bad actors could be the Russians, they could be the Trump administration, they could be George Soros, they could be the Gaza Health Ministry, they could be the Mossad, like whoever your bad actor is, right? Mm-hmm. Are deliberately releasing this misinformation into the ecosystem to misdirect people and cause them to not see what Soros is really up to. And this is fascinating because this is a theory of conspiracy theories that theorizes that conspiracy theories are the result of a conspiracy, right? It is a conspiracy to produce misinformation and use it to mislead the public so that you can secretly do whatever nefarious thing you're doing that, blackmail Trump with the P-tape or whatever. So yeah, of course, right. Yeah. They're of course mainstream conspiracy theories. And we know about those because usually 40 years after the fact, the Washington Post will dump a bunch of declassified documents, and it turns out that the biggest acid casualty you knew in 1975 was absolutely right about everything that they said. It's just that nobody cares anymore. They tried, the elder Bush Senior's father, Prescott, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he was a member of the millionaires coup, right? They were going to depose Franklin Roosevelt and replace him with Smedley Butler, and the New York Times called that a hoax, and then it turned out that was true.
I think it's called the Businessman's Plot. Which we will return to because I actually know a bunch about that stuff. But yeah, no, look, there were my point, but that sort of gets to my longstanding position about conspiracies is the reason why most conspiracy theories are untrue is that conspiracies are really freaking hard.
Sure. Yeah.
And that the idea that George W. Bush could pull off 9/11 without a single whistleblower, without anybody leaking anything, without anybody saying, wait a second, I'm not going to kill thousands of Americans, and then having to be silenced in some way, right? I mean, it's like, let's just stipulate for the sake of conversation that George W. Bush could be that evil.
Sure.
I don't think he was, but that's fine. It's perfectly, but like, if you assume he's that evil, do we really think he was that competent that he could pull off, this thing and pin it successfully on a bunch of Muslim people? If he was that competent, why'd Iraq go so badly? Why'd Afghanistan go so badly? It's that kind of thing. It's like this idea that there is people in Washington or the Jews or whoever are so unbelievably competent at doing things. And yet it turns out that like nobody really can get what they want in this life very easily. And certainly they can't do it in secret. And that's my problem. Conspiracy theories end up being just these just so stories that make people feel good about their plight in the world.
It is also, though, I agree, right? George Bush, his great sin was that he, simply killed 1 million Iraqis and didn't care. Not that he was a nefarious genius. We are, though, there's this sort of saw, and you didn't say this, but got close to it, and people do say this all the time, right? That conspiracy theories are supposed to be some kind of comfort, that it actually makes you feel better about the world to think people are in control. It seems to me to be more of a comfort to think, like everyone does, that this stuff all happened until roughly 1930 and then it stopped. Because if I tell you, look, this is true, and in 1271 in Genoa, right, they were an Italian merchant state, and they wanted to seize some trade routes from Florence, but these are little proto-democracies. They can't just claim a divine mandate to go invade Florence. So some of the mercantile bankers said, okay, we're going to hire some Hessian mercenaries. We're going to have them burn some of our cargo ships in the night. And then they do it and they say, oh my God, the Florentines, how could they? And, the bourgeois in Genoa rally behind them, and they give them capital and guns and manpower, and they go invade Florence in retaliation, and they make off. And I made that story up, right? That didn't happen. But if I told anybody that happened, that sounds totally plausible. Of course, of course, people in the 13th century lied about stuff and did little plots to stage wars. And I agree that I do not think that George Bush staged 9/11 in order to invade Iraq. But it is the same story, and it's odd to me that it's totally plausible if I posit that it happened in pre-modernity, and this totally seems implausible to us now. Now, maybe it is just that it's easier to imagine merchant houses in Genoa in the 1270s getting away with it, right? That like, there may be 2 whistleblowers and they could just have them killed and that would be fine. Mm-hmm. And now, yes, of course, to do 9/11 secretly as an inside job, you'd need thousands and thousands of people, none of whom ever said anything about it. Although, in the Kennedy administration, they were going to kill a bunch of civilians and blow up military installations in Florida and frame the Cubans for it so that we could stage a land invasion. And Kennedy vetoed it, so we didn't do it. But it got all the way up to the Joint Chief of Staff, and this isn't, a conspiracy theory. We have documents. They did plan this. Now, had they done it, we would probably know, right? Somebody would have. That's my point. I'm not saying at some point.
I in no way want to make the case that people are incapable of wanting to do evil things that are very complicated. My point is simply that the complications are one of the, as an empirical matter, why most conspiracies. This is from the second episode of this podcast. It's been like one of the recurring refrains is that if I try to explain to people who live outside of Washington what's one thing about Washington what's one common misconception, it's this idea that everybody knows what they're doing, right? Sure, that like you have a press conference, you announce some piece of legislation or some new policy, and it all unfolds exactly as you planned. When in reality, it turns out that you held the press conference, but you hadn't really checked your ideas, or you had, debated, and you had no idea that this guy was going to oppose it for this reason. And then it turns out that somebody on your staff said something stupid on Twitter 10 years ago and blah, 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 blah. It's a giant movable feast of chaotic things with different power centers. There is no red rope that once you get behind it, you get to the real decision makers who can plan out life for everybody with great precision and expertise and success. That's just not a thing in Washington. It's mostly well-intentioned people trying to do what they think is right and screwing up at it.
Yeah, well, in full circle, this is also why we can't really solve the mental health crisis.
Right.
Right? These were all, and in fact, right, those hospitals they built in the 19th century you mentioned earlier, yeah, those were a charitable project. That
Right.
was the result of, we keep having to put these crazy people in prison and they don't belong there. We need to build them some hospitals. Oh no, the hospitals are torture facilities. Well, we got to let them out of the hospitals. Well,
Right.
now they're on the street, right? And everyone at every stage of this was always, I think, at least in their own hearts, well-intentioned, even if their
Yeah.
intentions would seem bizarre to us now. Even
And
the people who wanted to, and I've made this joke before, no one will ever let me write it, which is my modest proposal, which is, if you're really serious about the mental health crisis and you don't want any bad things to happen, and you're okay with suspending civil liberties because you'll lock people up forever, but that costs too much, I should have been euthanized at point of diagnosis, just like everybody else. And there are people historically who have thought that, and I suppose somebody who thought that would be well-intentioned in a way. And God knows that's probably the next frontier, right? Because on the right, broadly, we have, if a mentally ill person makes you too uncomfortable in public, you can choke them to death. And on the left, we have, you should be allowed to get medical assistance in dying, even if your only health condition is you're sad. And these two tendencies, I suspect, like deinstitutionalization, are eventually going to reconverge on, what if it was just kinder to kill everybody with these problems? I doubt anyone will propose that as serious legislation, but we are doing it, right? People are murdered for these reasons. People are allowed to commit suicide for these reasons. And it'll be a fun new frontier in deinstitutionalization, which is, I guess, just like it's not a good word for life that lends itself to that same pattern, but,
yeah.
Just euthanasia.
All right, so I don't want to end on that dark a note.
Sure.
So one last question, and then I'll set you free. You said earlier that you're a committed Freudian.
Sure. I also said I'm a Catholic and a committed socialist and a believer in the Lacanian real.
The socialist and Catholic thing have gone together many a time in the
Sure.
past, so there's no inherent contradiction there. But a big chunk of our conversation has been about meds and serious underlying medical conditions. And when I hear Freud, I hear, and maybe this is unfair to your definition or your understanding of Freud, which is going to be better than mine. I hear a commitment to talk therapy, that psychological problems can be fixed by talking, and yet a big chunk of your premise in your life experience is that talking will not do it. It requires meds. And so I'm just wondering how you square the Freudian with the sort of medical part of it.
Oh, sure. All right. I've never been subject to, I don't believe psychoanalysis can cure schizophrenia, although Lacan did think that, but since he couldn't successfully demonstrate that fact, it didn't catch on. No, I two ways in which I love Freud. The more serious, less serious, hard to say. Freudianism, both in the strict Freudian sense and in, I guess, whatever, like the broad Freudian sense, right? It's not that I think it has access to truth. I think it has access to wisdom, right? It is an old way. It is a custom. It is a magic. It is a form of mysticism. I mean, true analytic experience where you totally go into total free association. It seems like Kabbalic mysticism, as we've simply invented, the praying and fasting until God speaks directly to you, but in scientific clothes. I do not believe that undergoing psychoanalysis will cure serious mental illness. And by the way, Freud didn't think that. Freud didn't treat schizophrenics. I mean, the original meaning of borderline is that you're on the borderline between neurosis and psychosis, and you're at the outer limits of what analysis can treat. But it's so fun. And it is just, it's something that concedes that it's an elaborate system of symbols and metaphors and not literally the truth about your brain. I mean, some Freudians would disagree with that, but that's nuts to think that there's actually a thing, the superego in your head. Nobody really thinks that. And my sort of retreat from politics and into conceiving of myself more as a writer and as anything else second is, what a pleasure to think about the sort of difficulties of reality as revealed by Freud's particular brand of 19th century Viennese magic. It's appealing for the same reason that monks are interesting. Two, that said, we're all Freudians now. And I would make this argument, we're all Freudians, we're all Marxists. We all like to pretend to a certain extent that we're not, but there is a kind of historical figure who is so influential in their thinking that what we continue to attribute to their name is their sort of most outlandish ideas. And what we don't attribute to their name anymore is common sense. So do you develop an Oedipal complex at the age of 3 that literally explains your behavior? Well, probably not. But when people talk about Freud, they think of the Oedipal complex. Do you believe that you are not a purely rational actor in the way that Enlightenment thinkers thought you were, and that you are subject to psychic forces in your semi and subconscious that were in some way shaped by prior experiences that you can't fully consciously articulate? Well, almost everyone thinks that now, and that is also Freud, and we all think that. It's just seems trivially true. In the same way that historical events may happen because of the sort of slow tectonic movement of the relations between different classes of people, and not solely great men making big decisions, is a kind of Marxism. That's just not what anyone means when they say they're a Marxist. So I don't know. Freud is just a figure of fascination for me. And if, psychiatry, and we didn't really get into it, I do have certain anti-psychiatric sympathies, obviously not extensive ones because I take psych meds, but Thomas Szasz wasn't stupid, right? These people do have points on any number of issues. Psychiatry is suspicious, and I take the sort of Freudian subconscious to be the way, the truth, and the light, but in the way that implies is something other than an empirical fact. It's just a source of pleasure.
All right. I think we can kill it there.
Sure.
Emmett Rensin, thank you so much for doing this. And we'll put links to the piece, obviously, and to your book in the show notes and all of that kind of stuff. And I hope it wasn't too painful for you.
No, it's fine. I hope you didn't wake up too many times and go, why are we talking about the mystical insights of Freud?
No, I love that shit. Like, I would have, like, if I had my druthers, I would start with that sometimes.